cabin in the Black Hills. This happened about a year ago, and I still don't have all the answers. It all started when I moved into a cabin out in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I was going through some stuff, work stress, relationship problems, the usual life garbage, and I just wanted to get away from everything. I found this place online, and it seemed perfect. Cheap rent, secluded, surrounded by trees and hills. The pictures looked great, and I figured a few weeks out there would give me the peace and quiet I needed to clear my head. So, I packed up a few things, threw them in my old car, and drove out there. The cabin wasn't exactly easy to find. It was a couple of hours outside of town, down this long dirt road that felt like it hadn't been used in years. The trees were thick on both sides, and the road just kept going deeper into the woods. I remember feeling a little uneasy as I drove, but I shook it off. I wanted to be alone, right? This was exactly what I'd asked for. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Small, rustic, with a big porch and a view of the hills. There wasn't a single house in sight, just trees and more trees. The air was cool and smelled like pine. At first I thought I'd made a great decision. The first few days were pretty normal. I spent most of my time hiking around the area, exploring the hills and taking pictures. At night, I'd sit out on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind in the trees and looking at the stars. It was quiet, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could actually breathe. But after a few days, things started to feel off. It's hard to explain, but the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like there was something in the air. I started feeling like I wasn't really alone out there, like something was watching me. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder when I was outside or staring out the window, expecting to see someone or something out in the trees. One night I was sitting on the porch, just looking at the stars, when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the more I was sure I saw something moving between the trees. It was far away, just on the edge of where the porch light reached, but there was definitely something out there. A shadow or a figure, I couldn't tell. It was tall and thin, and it moved slowly, like it was just pacing back and forth. I stared at it for what felt like forever, but it didn't come any closer. It just stayed out there, in the dark, moving in and out of the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, and I went back inside. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I went outside, I felt like I was being watched. It was like there were eyes on me, no matter where I went. Then that night, I saw it again. I was in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard something outside. It was quiet at first, just a soft rustling, like leaves being pushed around by the wind, but it didn't stop. It got louder, like someone was walking around the cabin, stepping on twigs and leaves. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. I didn't dare look. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They circled the cabin again, and then faded into the distance. The next morning, I found footprints outside. They weren't mine. They were big, bigger than any shoe I'd ever seen, and they looked old, like they had been there for a long time. But they couldn't have been. I would have noticed them before. That's when I started getting scared. I wanted to leave, but something was stopping me. I can't explain it, but it was like the cabin didn't want me to go. Every time I thought about packing up and driving away, I felt this weight in my chest, like it was impossible to leave. So I stayed. The days started blending together after that. I stopped going outside as much. I spent most of my time inside the cabin, pacing around, staring out the windows. Every night, I heard the footsteps. Sometimes they were close, right outside the door or the windows, and sometimes they were further away, out in the trees. But they were always there. I started seeing the figure more often too. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of it between the trees, just standing there, watching. It never came closer, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was waiting for something. I don't know what, but it was waiting. Then one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the footsteps outside, when I heard something different. A knock. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the window. I told myself it was just a branch or the wind, but then it happened again, louder this time. I sat up, my heart racing, and looked at the window. There, standing just outside, was the figure. It was closer than it had ever been before, pressed right up against the glass. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, ready to bolt outside, but as soon as I opened the door, I stopped. There on the porch was something I'll never forget. A pile of old, decaying animal bones, arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle was a single human bone, a femur, I think. It was old and brittle, like it had been there for years. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, I packed my stuff and left. I didn't care about the weight in my chest anymore. I didn't care about whatever was out there. I just needed to get out. When I got home, I tried looking up the cabin online, but I couldn't find anything. The listing was gone, and I couldn't even find a record of it ever being there. It was like the cabin never existed. I don't know what I saw out there or what was watching me, but I'll never go back to the Black Hills again. I still hear the footsteps sometimes, though. Late at night, when everything's quiet, I swear I can hear them, just outside my window. When my family first saw the house, we were all stunned by its beauty. A towering Victorian-era mansion nestled in the woods, far from any main roads. My wife, Rachel, was the first to fall in love with it. It had these huge bay windows, tall ceilings, and a wraparound porch that gave it a romantic, eerie vibe. She saw it as a chance for us to leave the city behind, to raise our kids in a quiet, peaceful place. At first, I agreed. It was everything we dreamed of, big enough for the kids to run around, and it had history. The realtor told us it was built in the late 1800s, owned by a wealthy family who apparently vanished without a trace. We thought it was just a rumor to add mystery to the place. After all, old houses have stories, right? The house felt alive, I guess, but in a good way. Or at least that's what I thought at first. There was this strange energy about it, though. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the house had been waiting for us. I didn't say anything to Rachel. I didn't want to freak her out. We moved in, excited about starting our new life. The first few nights were peaceful. Our daughter, Lily, and our son, Ethan, were over the moon about their new rooms. Everything seemed perfect. But then things started to happen. Small things at first, like doors creaking open, even though we had closed them, or lights flickering when no one was touching the switches. I figured it was just the house settling. It was old, after all. Then one night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like footsteps. I lay there in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear. It came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hallway outside our room. My heart pounded in my chest as I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Rachel. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. I crept to the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued. They sounded closer now, moving towards the stairs. I flicked on the light, and that's when it stopped. Dead silence. I didn't see anything, but I could feel something was wrong. It was like the air had gotten heavier, colder. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just the wind. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I asked Rachel if she had heard anything. She just laughed and said I was probably dreaming. Maybe she was right, but things kept getting stranger. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in places we never left them. The kids started talking about seeing shadows in their rooms. At first, we thought they were just having nightmares, but it felt like more than that. One night, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard Ethan crying from upstairs. I rushed to his room and found him sitting up in bed, shaking. "Daddy, there's a man in my closet," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I froze. My stomach dropped. I opened the closet, but of course, there was nothing there. I tried to calm him down, telling him it was just his imagination. But he was adamant. He kept saying he saw a man standing there just watching him. I told Rachel about it, and we brushed it off as another bad dream. But deep down, I was starting to get worried. Things escalated after that. The noises got louder, more frequent. We'd hear whispers in the middle of the night, but when we went to check, no one was there. Rachel finally admitted she was hearing things too, but she didn't want to scare the kids. Then one evening, while I was fixing something in the basement, I found it. Behind an old cabinet, there was this small door, one I'd never noticed before. It was strange because the realtor hadn't mentioned any secret rooms. I forced it open. It was a narrow staircase leading down into what looked like a hidden cellar. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down. The smell hit me first, damp, like the place had been sealed up for decades. But what I saw next, I wish I hadn't gone down there. The room was filled with old furniture, dusty and covered in cobwebs. But in the corner there was something else, an old wooden box. I opened it, and inside were dozens of photographs, old black and white pictures of people standing in front of the mansion. But something wasn't right. They all looked wrong. Their faces were twisted, almost distorted, like the photos had been burned or damaged in some way. Then I found a journal, dated back to the early 1900s. It was written by a man named Charles, the original owner of the house. He talked about strange occurrences, much like what we had been experiencing. But towards the end of the journal, things got darker. He wrote about seeing things that weren't there, people in the walls, whispering to him. He said the house was alive, feeding off their fear, driving them mad. I ran back upstairs, my mind racing. That's when I saw her, Rachel, standing at the top of the stairs, staring at me with a blank expression. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "What's wrong?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless. And then she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, colder. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Rachel?" I whispered. Suddenly she blinked, and it was like she snapped out of it. She looked at me, confused. "What are you doing down there?" she asked, her voice normal again. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell her what I had just seen. But that night, I packed up the kids and we left. We didn't say goodbye to the house. We didn't even sell it. I don't know what happened there, but I'll never forget the way Rachel's eyes looked that night. I never thought I'd be the type to believe in any of this paranormal stuff. I mean, I always figured ghost stories were just that, stories. But that all changed after what happened when my wife and I bought our new house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place in the countryside, quiet, far from the noise of the city. It wasn't a mansion like you'd see in horror movies or anything like that, just a regular old farmhouse. We were looking for somewhere to settle down and start a family, and the price was a steal, so we went for it. The house had this odd charm. It was well over 100 years old, and while it definitely needed some work, we fell in love with it. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had passed away, and their kids were eager to sell it off quickly. Seemed like a win for us. The neighbors were friendly, though they seemed a bit hesitant when we mentioned moving into the place. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first few weeks were fine. It was peaceful. But then, like in every horror movie cliche, things started getting weird. At first, it was little things. Doors creaking open by themselves, cold drafts in the middle of the summer, stuff you'd blame on an old house settling. One day, we decided to start renovating the basement. It was unfinished and full of junk left behind by the previous owners, boxes of old clothes, rusty tools, that kind of thing. But while we were cleaning it out, we found something strange. In the far corner of the room, behind an old cabinet, there was this section of the wall that looked different, like the plaster didn't quite match the rest. I'm not a construction expert, but it was obvious that someone had sealed off part of the basement, and after a bit of work, I managed to break through the plaster. Behind it, there was a small hidden room. It was empty, except for one thing, an old rocking chair. The wood was worn and cracked, the paint peeling. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But the thing that really unnerved me was the way it was placed, facing the corner of the room, as if someone had sat there staring at the wall for years. I should have stopped right then. I should have sealed the room back up and never mentioned it. But instead, we pulled the chair out, dusted it off, and brought it upstairs as some kind of weird antique decoration. That's when things really started to go downhill. The first night after moving the chair upstairs, I woke up to a soft creaking sound. At first, I thought it was Sarah shifting in bed. But when I opened my eyes, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway. I got up, figuring one of the windows was open or something. But as soon as I stepped into the hall, the noise stopped. I checked the windows, all closed. The doors were locked. Everything was fine. But when I turned to go back to bed, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The rocking chair, it was gently moving. I felt this chill go down my spine, but I told myself it was just a draft. I pushed the chair back into place, but it didn't stop nagging at me. Over the next few days, Sarah started acting strange. She was normally so upbeat and full of energy, but now she was tired all the time, pale and distracted. She kept saying she was having nightmares, but she wouldn't tell me what they were about. One evening, I found her sitting in that damn chair, just staring at the wall, exactly like it had been in the basement. She didn't even realize I was there until I called her name. When she looked up at me, there was something in her eyes, something I can't explain. It was like she wasn't entirely herself. Things kept getting worse. We both started hearing things. Soft whispers at night, footsteps in the hallway, even though no one else was in the house. Sarah was barely eating or sleeping, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to admit it, but I knew she was terrified. So was I. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find her gone. I panicked, thinking she'd gone outside or maybe sleepwalking. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no answer. Finally, I went down to the basement. She was there, standing in front of the hidden room. The door was open again, even though I'd boarded it up after we pulled the chair out. The light was dim, but I could see her outline, standing completely still in the middle of the room. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. When I got closer, I realized she was whispering something, over and over. I could barely make it out, but it sounded like, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I reached out to touch her shoulder, and she turned to me, her eyes wide and terrified. "We shouldn't have touched it," she whispered. Before I could ask her what she meant, the door behind us slammed shut, and we were plunged into darkness. The air turned icy cold, and I could feel something in the room with us. Something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. I don't remember how we got out, but somehow we made it back upstairs. The next day, I hired someone to seal that room for good. We put the chair back where we found it and left it alone. I don't know what's down there, and I don't want to know. We moved out not long after that. I've heard that the new owners haven't had any issues, but every now and then I wonder if that chair is still sitting in the basement, waiting for someone else to find it. All I know is that whatever was in that house, it didn't want us there, and we were lucky to leave when we did.